good. I think. So much easier without that. Okay, well, welcome everybody to our second lecture. It's spring. We have a lot of things to be happy about, but we're particularly happy about having this lecture series. We feel so privileged to give the information about our history and who lived here. And I'd like to thank John. We didn't thank him last week. John Harlow, who is with LessArts and is also with Channel 11. So he's filming, and it will be available through this website. Also on the History House website, just historyhouse.org. Okay, my name is Patricia Haran. I work at Skeleton History House. This program, which will run all the way through the end of September, has been funded by the Davis Family Foundation. We wrote the grant in 2019, anticipating that we would run it 20 and 21. Of course, you know what happened then. Not doing things like this. We were given only until September to spend that money, or we would have to send it back to the Davis folks. So we then went ahead to a schedule of 2 lectures per month. So usually going to be on Thursday, and Susan will fill you in on what some of the dates are and people coming up. Welcome, and now I'll turn it over to Susan. She's going to talk a little bit more about the program, and she's going to talk about Dr. Darren Ranco.
Hi, I'm Susan Cochran. Welcome everybody again. Some of you have not been here before and some have been, so it's great to have a sort of a continuity with this conversation. You should know that Mark Tanner has been very helpful to us in providing this place to us for free. And Jeremy Lehan is saving our asses as far as I'm concerned, because he's handling all of the Zoom and all of the tech stuff. We could not do this without him. This project began 3 years ago when Patricia and I met while we were sort of all discussing the issue of the Indian mascot here in town. And we felt that we really needed to be educated, that the town did, or people who were interested in this, be educated more in Wabanaki history and culture. And so we were referred by Barry Dana actually to talk to Darren Ranco, who you will be hearing tonight, and John Bear Mitchell, who both teach up at university. And they have been essential partners for us in this. And every decision we've made, every speaker that we're getting, we got through them. And all of these decisions had to be run by Darren and John Bear to kind of get the okay, because it was so, we didn't want to step on any toes or cause any difficulties. And Darren basically chose this final title for the series, Wabanaki Voices, Past, Present, and Future. And that's what we'll be all talking about. So today we're continuing this conversation that started 2 weeks ago. And Darren has a joint appointment with the Department of Anthropology and the George Mitchell Center for Environment and Watershed Research, and is the chair of the Native American programs at UMO and the coordinator of the Native American research there. He did an undergraduate program at Dartmouth in anthropology and classical studies. and then he got his master's in environmental law, is sort of a special sort of subset in environmental law at Vermont Law School, and then a PhD from Harvard. And he taught at Dartmouth for a while, and then UMO asked him to come speak there, teach over here, and let him sort of build his whole program all by himself, which was just great. His research focuses on the ways in which Indigenous communities in the United States resist environmental destruction by using Indigenous diplomacies to protect cultural resources, and how Western knowledge systems rooted in colonial contexts continue to expose Indigenous people to an inordinate amount of environmental risk. He teaches classes on Indigenous intellectual property rights, research ethics, environmental justice, and tribal government. He's a member of the Penobscot Indian Nation, and he's particularly interested in how better research relationships can be made between universities, native and non-native researchers, and the indigenous communities. So welcome, Darren. We're very lucky to have him.
Wonderful to be joining you here tonight. It sounded like you were blaming me for something when you said that I was
for choosing the title.
Oh yeah, right. That's right. That's okay. I'm gonna blame John Bear probably. Yeah, it's amazing and really great to see this series happening and mumble mumble. We're gonna stay with the lights on. We're afraid of the dark here. Yeah, it's really it's you guys have put in so much work though. I mean, we're just like come up with these ideas and go chase this down. So you've been really adamant that this happened here in this space because I think I'm gonna talk a lot about the Kennebec River Valley and some of the things over here. Although I'm gonna mostly talk about Penobscot people because we're awesome, as you could tell from last week's speaker as well. So yeah, I mean, as I was preparing, this is the 18th century diplomacy, which I'm going to talk about, is something I haven't been working on actively in these last few years. So it was interesting to go back and kind of prepare this talk and think about its resonance for what's been happening in the state with our rights and legislation. So there are going to be some echoes, and I'm happy to talk about them, but I'm not going to talk directly in my, the presentation is going to be talking about primarily 18th century things. Yeah, so I'll share my screen and start the presentation.
With the lights on, okay.
Want to hide things. Hide floating controls. Okay. So here's the title of my talk. Okay. So, I wasn't really sure. It's always hard to where do you begin? One of my Penobscot mentors who passed the last couple of years, Jim Sapir, would always begin his presentations with Adam and Eve Sapir. And of course, I can't start there. But I do want to there are a couple of sort of critical context to understand what's happening here with Wabanaki diplomacy and in the Kennebec River Valley and other places across what is now Maine. And the two contexts I'm going to talk about is the doctrine of discovery, which hopefully some people have heard a little bit about, and then our diplomacy, our diplomatic traditions as Wabanaki people. And so those will be the sort of critical context. And then I'm going to look specifically at Dummer's War, Dummer's Treaty. It's in its aftermath as a case study. And that's directly tied to understanding the role of various forms of deception, mistranslation that led to eventually the Phipps Scalp Proclamation, which probably people are aware of as well, which is the bounties on our scalps as Penobscot people. And then I want to draw sort of some comparisons in terms of misunderstandings that lead to structural forms of structural violence and denial of Indigenous rights. But I'll let you guys make those connections if you want to do that. That's what I do as a teacher. You decide. I just present. Okay. All right. So I did want to. I can show you. Maine wasn't always a space of primarily white people. Even in 1829, you can see the settlements of the state, the colored in areas. And so one of the things I like to do is talk about how at statehood, for example, Maine was still primarily a Wabanaki space, territory-wise. And that changes obviously over the next 60 to 80 years. And also critical to this is the idea that our territory as Wabanaki people is stretches across this entire area. Maine is a new concept in terms of Wabanaki people. And so the last 200 years have been important, have shaped our experiences in important ways as Wabanaki people. But when we think about our history and our place, the state of Maine is just a small component of that. And so that's the territorial thing. So you can see this map. This is one of the first European-made maps of our territory. It tries to shape the rivers, the Penobscot, kind of back into placement of some of the tribes. And it's from L'Escarbot from the early part of the 17th century. You can see this province of Maine. So that's taking shape of sort of the territory of what becomes Maine later. Of course, the settlement map of Maine from 1778 to 1820, moving inland. And some of those same pressures are what I'm going to talk about in regards to diplomacy on the Maine quote unquote frontier in the first half of the 18th century. Okay, so this is just contemporary Wabanaki tribal nations, what is now Maine, and just in case everyone, I'm sure everyone knows this. Also, I need to redo my slide. Aroostook Band is now Micmac Nation. They officially changed their name a couple months ago, so that shows you how up to date I am. And then the location of our lands that we have control over, are broader than those seats of government that I showed you in the previous slide where the tribes are located. The majority of these lands were recovered by our tribes because of the 1980 Settlement Act. And so this is where I want to start, and this is where I'll end in some ways. But I wanted to start with this idea that, and it has resonance with tribal sovereignty, of course. In a letter to the English Crown, actually sent a bunch of letters to a lot of places. Laurent Soghorab, a really famous Penobscot diplomat in the first part of the 18th century, sent after a French priest had translated a treaty that he had signed to him in a way that was very different than the way that the English translators had translated it to him. He's like, that's not what I agreed to. And the key part of that was he agreed to be an English subject and part of the English crown. And he's like, no way did I say that. And so he clarified his statement saying that I acknowledge your king. Do not hence infer that I acknowledge your king as my king and king of my lands. Here lies my distinction, my Indian distinction. God hath willed that I have no king and I be master of my lands in common, right? So this is the statement of self-determination, of sovereignty. You could imagine Chief Francis saying something like this, maybe in a contemporary speech, but this ongoing misunderstanding of proclaiming us as subjects to first England and then later Americans, that this is a critical part of my discussion today. Okay, so that's where I want to end up. To understand why maybe the mistranslation and misunderstanding, we have to talk a little bit about what the English in particular are bringing to this equation into a space of Wabanaki diplomacy. They're bringing this notion that only Christian nations have certain rights. Non-Christian peoples, non-Christian nations, starting in the 11th century with the Crusades, but really canonized in the 15th, starting in the 15th century through papal law, creates a hierarchy of civilizations that puts Christian nations on top and everyone else below them. And this formulation has everything to do with how colonization works, how our property exists in the United States and other settler societies. It's all traced back to this what we call the doctrine of discovery or the Christian doctrine of discovery and domination. Okay, so the modern day, I love this because historians, you're like, where does modern history start? Apparently it can start in the 15th century. Anyway, the modern day version of this legal principle was started to be canonized as the Spanish and Portuguese had competing claims to control and colonize the Canary Islands. And to settle this dispute, the Pope in 1455 granted Portugal the power, and this is referred to as, it's a papal bull, it's referred to as the Romanus Pontifex. And he granted Portugal the ability to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, which is what they were calling Muslims at the time, and pagans whatsoever, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to convert them to his, meaning the settlers, use and profit, and to possess these islands, lands, harbors, and seas, and they do of right belong and pertain to the said King Alfonso and his successors. Okay, so that's the orientation of hierarchy in its implementation. So not surprisingly, you know, and some things happened in 1492 that I think people know. And in response to that, in 1493, Spain sought papal approval for the discoveries, quote unquote, of Columbus in the New World. And according to this developing international law, Pope Alexander VI issued three papal bulls, three sort of edicts, and ordered that the lands Columbus discovered that were not hitherto discovered by others belonged to Spain. So because, and the logic was, these are non-Christian nations. When a Christian nation shows up, they can make a claim, but you have to be first. So that's why he said they weren't previously discovered, and they had to be a Christian nation sort of operating through the official network of the kings and queens of Europe. Okay. And then he further granted Spain lands it would discover in the future if they were not in the actual possession of any Christian king. So it sets up a framework of, you can call it collusion, kind of like, they're like, we're only gonna allow each other to possess these lands and these foreign lands. And we're just gonna say, we'll compete with each other, but we all agree, those people over there, if they are even people, right, have no interest or ability to control their lands. Okay, so that's the, and then more stuff happens in 1529 at the Treaty of Saragossa, the countries, Spain and Portugal, extended the line around the globe, sorry, not Hegel, the globe, and divided up the Pacific Ocean, its islands and lands, and all this fun stuff. And they draw lines, they literally draw lines on maps, right, of the time. It's like, why do they speak Portuguese in Brazil? Oh, that was the line going through the Caribbean and into South America, right? They literally, that's like, why Spain, Portugal, you know, and then they start dividing up. So then, jealous and obviously competing to acquire empires and riches for themselves, England, Holland, France, all used this international law and worked in sort of, it started to move out of the papal bulls into what became international law. That's why you have a treaty here, Saragossa. You know, the papal bulls still keep coming, but as Rome's sort of international frame starts to diminish by the, you know, especially into the 17th century, it becomes international law, that sort of the beginnings of international law, treaties and agreements across the sovereigns in Europe. So they start to do all the claims as well, still using only Christian nations, people working on behalf of Christian nations can claim land, and the people who are there maybe they have some rights, maybe they have souls, we're not so sure, but they don't have a full claim to title, to transfer their own title for lands they've lived on for thousands of years, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what's happening. So this system of this hierarchy is what sort of European colonization meant around much of the world, including, of course, the United States. And it continued, and this law is actually in most settler nation states common law. There's somewhere in an edict in common law, we see it in the in the US in what they call the Marshall Trilogy, where they say like, well, we gave them civilization and Christianity, and yeah, maybe they don't have full title to their own lands, and we get to treat them as second class. But there was an even exchange because we brought them all this great stuff. And then you also see this in state of Maine common law in this 1842 decision called Murch versus Tomer, where they're like, oh, they're basically imbeciles. And we're supposed to treat them okay, but they can't, possess their own lands, and they're kind of like children. So anyway, there's this. Okay, so that's what the English are bringing to the table. Hopefully that's somewhat clear. As for us as Wabanaki people, we're bringing this ongoing set of diplomatic engagements, roles and responsibilities that are rooted in this place. Literally, I showed you the map of Wabanaki territory, our connection to each other as Wabanaki nations, as well as our connection in treaty relationships with non-humans are rooted in this place. So it's the apparatus of Wabanaki diplomacy is rooted in a couple of different sort of key concepts. Or sorry, I said, here's the place where this action happens. So when the English came here, we already had a system of kind of jurisprudence and how to handle international law disputes between our different nations. Eventually this happens to come at the formation of our confederacy, called the Wabanaki Confederacy. And it gets more formalized as the European powers show up with their own sort of set of rules. We start to have more formal processes in response to the English, but the basic structure and rules of our diplomatic traditions are rooted in many of our sort of original stories in terms of our responsibility to place, species, each other. So the diplomacy, our first diplomatic agreements are with non-humans, right? So if you heard, some of our transformer tales, we talk about these relationships and these tales of these, many of the beasts were very large at one point, they become small, those kinds of things. I think James last week talked about the cow moose and goose cow. Did he do that one? Yeah. So I mean, that's part of our diplomatic tradition, is our connection to those places and our responsibility to them are rooted in that story, right? Okay. So, and this is the scholarly side of it. So our diplomacy is rooted in sort of an international relationship. It's multicultural, multinational. It's part of our wampum belt traditions. Our wampum belts contain the agreements, and these are mnemonic devices and sacred sort of texts for our roles and responsibilities through our diplomacy. There's a sort of set of protocols, and I mentioned that it was formalized. It was sort of made more formal during the sort of our response to the Europeans showing up on our shores. And there's a couple of scholars who talk about our confederacy. Willard Walker talks about it as it's taken many forms and is adapted to external pressures, has existed for at least 3 centuries. He wrote this like 60 years ago. In the minds of Wabanaki peoples, Matthew Dennis talks about it as engaging also persuasive discourse. When we think of diplomacy and the protocols around diplomacy, we often think about that as persuasive, like people get into a room and they argue out points, right? But there's a very strict protocol for Wabanaki diplomacy rooted in persuasive discourse. And some of it has to do with having a fine mind and not upsetting your opponent in this. There's a great example of in 1717, there was a treaty in Arausik signed between Wabanaki people and the English. There was a new governor general of Massachusetts at the time, and he really had no experience engaging with Wabanaki diplomacy. And as we were listing out our demands and sort of laying out sort of our perspective, he like lost control. He was just like, how dare you? And he like smashed a bunch of things. He knocked over like, there's a whole sort of like a framework of belts and different things in the room. And then the lead Penobscot diplomat had to recuse himself because he screwed up by making this guy get angry, Do you see what I'm saying? Like that should not happen in our protocols in the system of so that's just a good example of like what are we meaning by persuasive discourse? It's also about having a fine mind and being reasoned. Okay. This is just from the wampum records. There's a notion, and this is in Passamaquoddy, Zidakwin, Dole Westu. Everyone talks or has a right to talk. Oftentimes in these diplomatic proceedings, there's a sort of distinct order, but everyone gets a space. But then, you know, the order matters, who gets to talk when. It's based on other sort of protocols and who has sort of seniority and that sort of thing. Right. Okay, and so this is, I'm trying to set up like, how might this lead to the English are bringing, you know, hierarchy and they're the only ones that can own property, things like that. And of course, Wabanaki people are bringing a different set of tools, rubrics to a space of agreement or disagreement. Another part of this, and Harold Prinz, many people have talked about it, is that in our diplomatic traditions, there are kinship metaphors. So depending on your role in the particular confederacy at that time, you might be considered a brother or a father or a grandson or a grandfather, right? And that these kinship roles go with certain kinds of roles. They each have certain roles and responsibilities. I mean, brothers is the most common, and that's the notion that some egalitarian equality exists. And so Prinz is talking about younger and older brothers. More complex, as he says, is the term father, which that's a role and a responsibility to exercise protective care. So there's, you know, eventually some of the European powers in particular engagements become father or even grandfather at some point. Because they are existing in multiple spaces at times, so they have a broader set of responsibilities. So the Wabanaki would call them perhaps father. But they misunderstood. They thought that meant they were in charge, but in a Wabanaki perspective, these kinship metaphors are not sort of who's in control or who's in charge, but what roles and responsibilities you have to each other. So unaware, so the idea that you know, the governor of Canada, an extension, the King of France, was their French father. In contrast, the French and English typically attributed some sort of authoritarian power to the idea of father. But this was not what Wabanaki people meant. It actually meant that being a father actually is a lot harder than being a brother, because you have to protect, you have a role of protection over the people you are a father to. So there's a really difference of interpretation of what these kinship metaphors, and they had, as you'll see, some unfortunate consequences. Also, Prinz and David Gear write a lot about Wabanaki diplomacy and sort of this translation issue that are often strained by what Gear calls structural and grammatical differences between the respective languages, right? These are very different languages. English and Penobscot are from very different linguistic groups. You heard last week, sort of even how we think about place is rooted in language, and they can be very different. So the communications themselves, let's say that people were honestly trying to translate back and forth, and a lot of the translators were either traders, you know, people who had sort of engaged with Indians for a long period of time, learned language. Some of them had been captives, and some of our translators had been captives by the English. So like they were captives actually, if they were returned, became really important figures in both communities, English and Wabanaki. So these translators, missionaries, militia officers, I talked about that, and they were, you know, driven by prejudice, bias, and a real bias for the Europeans document sort of what was written on a document and how to understand that, what was written. And these translations, especially as we lead into what's happening during Dummer's War and the aftermath, translations were consistently done in this part of the world by three Englishmen, Joseph Bean, John Giles, and Samuel Jordan. And they were the only translators really in any of these treaty conferences for over the course of like 40 years, 30 to 40 years. I forget which one, I think Joseph Bean was a captive as a child. So he spoke Wabanaki languages, he grew up with them. But many people believe that he wasn't totally psyched that he was a captive when he was a kid. Anyway, okay, so I mean, that's understandable, of course. So this time period, even before 1725 into the 1740s. And I mentioned that the French Jesuit priest, Lauverjat, translated the true language of Dummer's Treaty. Remember that Laurent was like, no, I didn't agree to that. It's, you know, your king is your king. We have no king, we're free. So that sort of thing. Okay, so one of the things that, and I just don't have enough time to go and like, you know, there are these wars. And one thing I will reference that in the French have a bigger role in this area here along the Kennebec River, basically until the Norridgewock Massacre, right? Until that event, but they were already kind of withdrawing from a lot of Western Maine, the French, before that. And that's partly why it was sort of an open, you know, it was kind of vulnerable. But after Father Rawls was murdered, the French really stepped back. So it was a new diplomatic space, sort of the 1720s and into later time. But also after the Norridgewock Massacre, a lot of the tide was turned. Like the English were starting to lose a little bit, especially along the coast, especially sort of on the east side of the Penobscot River, and that's going to be important in this. But incursions they had made in forts and villages they had made, the Penobscot in particular, right, had forced them out of these new English settlements especially on the east side of the Penobscot River. So it was clear, like, English had definitely won a lot in this part of Maine, had pushed back the French, and a lot of the Norridgewock tribe, you know, went to Canada, they went to Penobscot. And although they were starting to come, you know, back in the year, there's a whole thing about that. But anyway, one of the things that's happening at this time is there's also a new orientation towards English claims to territory in the District of Maine. And this is called at various times the Plymouth Company land claims. It's called some other things as well, but it's basically that area along the Kennebec River here, down, sort of down from here, downstream. And this is sort of, you know, you can see that land disputed prior to Dummer's Treaty, which Dummer's Treaty settles, where the English make some incursions here into the Kennebec, the mouth of the Kennebec, and then a little bit east of here. But really what they wanted, and this was part of the Plymouth Company's idea, was they really wanted the entire sort of main stem of the Kennebec River, right? So that's what that dotted area is. So as they're thinking, Dummer's Treaty, we made some incursions, we have a firmer foothold as the English, this is our next step. And so that becomes very important. So what's in this treaty known as Dummer's Treaty? So it's literally called in the English, it's called the submission. So it's right in the title. So they weren't even really translating the title. The submission and agreement of the delegates of the Eastern Indians. Also referred to as Dummer's Treaty. So it tried to address this crucial problem of land ownership in disputed territories. So you saw that in that map, those black areas, that's from a Wabanaki perspective, that's really what Dummer's Treaty was about. They're like, they made some incursions, you know, like a lot of these treaties at the time, there was some compromise made by Indians, but it was usually like, we compromised to a village being there, but we don't want a fort there. We want a fort way far away. Like, so these negotiations were kind of in that kind of vein at the time. So it really was about setting up a peace, recognizing some of the former settlements, but made sure that this was, limiting English incursion into further areas, even though remember that dotted area is sort of what the English have in their mind. And then this disputed clause of, if I do these presents, in the name and behalf of the said tribes, make our submission unto his most excellent majesty, George, the King of England. So again, Laurent, by the time he gets this treaty back to the French priest at Penobscot, guy's like, did you really submit to the English crown? And he's like, no. Okay, so then he writes that thing. Okay. So the fuller quote in response to this translation is not only he realized my Indian distinction, he also says, and this is like a clarifying quote, as for what relates to your king, when you have asked me, I acknowledged him for king. I answered yes. But at the same time, it made you take notice that I do not understand to acknowledge him for my king, but only that owned that he was king in his kingdom as the king of France is king in his. So it's like, you can see how maybe the translation was just a misunderstanding. They're like, do you recognize him as your king? And you're like, yeah, he's a king. Like that, you can imagine some of that kind of going back and forth, but Geer is very convinced. He's a historian. He was a historian. He's very convinced that these translators were just purposely mistranslating it. Prins is a little less sure. I'm apt to agree with Geer. I encourage you all to, you can examine this, this record yourself and the Baxter manuscripts and all these sort of historical records. Okay. So a few years ago, Ian Saxene, who's a historian, published this award-winning paper, and it's called The Performance of Peace, Indian Speculators in the Politics of Property on the Maine Frontier, 1735 to 1737. And it's an award-winning paper because it's a really good paper, but it also captures some really interesting things about what the lead up is to basically, Dummer's Treaty is seen as a success. Even though Laurent is like, they think I agreed to something, no one did. It fashions a peace, relative peace. After a series of wars, it's a relative peace for 25 to 30 years, which is at the time a pretty major accomplishment. There was a real, and part of what Saxene points out in his piece is that part of it is that the people in control in Boston, the English, the governor general in Boston, at the time was really interested in peace as well. He thought that a more gradual expansion, even into the District of Maine, and he was more concentrating out sort of west in Western Massachusetts, and he was working with the governor of New York. So they were more interested in Western expansion. He thought, Maine, maybe someday, but we're gonna play that out like real slow. Saxene describes this tension that started to arise, not only in Maine, in other parts of English territory, where the tensions between what prospectors who were not part of like the governor general's immediate group, what they wanted out of these things. So, I don't know if people are familiar, the musical Hamilton, it's like, and apparently our founding fathers are mostly a bunch of land speculators, if you kind of follow along the story of that. Anyway, what were they speculating with? They were speculating with our lands as Native people. Anyway, so there's this tension between sort of the deeds that had been signed with the official sort of King of England. And then there are these other sort of more vague deeds that sort of predated a lot of the English sort of presence in the territory. And these land speculators were like, they'd get a piece of paper and they'd be like, yeah, it's part of this general grant from some Fargo Indian. It still kind of kept the rules of the road of the sort of Christian doctrine of discovery, and sort of only the English had a right to property, but it wasn't playing by the official order that those in power in Boston and in England wanted. But you see this real tension of those people who had already benefited, who already made their land speculating, and then more newcomers who are like, hey, where's ours? We need to make, this is, you could say like the founding of the state of Maine was also like the Bowdens and the, they wanted theirs finally. So that notion of speculation is part of what happens. So what's interesting in this particular connection with the Penobscots in 1736 with a guy named Sam Waldo, who had started this thing called the Muscungus Company. And this is again on the eastern side of the Penobscot River. He started to sell sort of tracts of land to people. He's not himself living there, but in Boston, the general court, he makes this claim that, oh, I actually have this sort of vague deed, I can sell it. And the Penobscots went directly to Boston and were like, this guy's selling land. We all agreed in Dummer's Treaty that this is not part of English territory. And the court in Boston agreed with them. They're like, absolutely, that's not a part of the agreement. So like most Wabanaki people, Dummer's Treaty had validated sort of land claims and sort of where the different parties were supposed to be. And this is good until the 1750s and things get awry. So these proprietors, Waldo's company, derived none of their rights directly from Indians or Indian deeds, right? So again, the Doctrine of Discovery says the European sovereign has to get the land from the Indians directly, and then they can distribute it amongst there. And it's very similar to what the United States sets up in 1790, the Non-Intercourse Act, which is only the federal government can sign treaties, and that forms the basis of our Maine Indian land claims that get sort of settled in 1980. So instead, this patent rested on an inherited share of this vast, vague Plymouth grant from 1629 and from a 1694 sale, which was probably coerced or even not even officially signed by Madaka-Wando. And no Penobscots had ever accepted that as a deed. No one before or after even knew about it. And there's just some vague piece of paper that Waldo, his company, and a couple other prospectors sort of had access to. So Saxene talks about, that finding and the general court in Boston siding with Indians, kind of like in 1975, the federal, the First Circuit sides with Wabanaki people saying that there's this federal responsibility, that there are these illegal treaties, et cetera, et cetera. But this starts to fall apart, partly because of the structure as we go in and changing leadership happens in Boston. So in 1741, the Duke of Newcastle, who controlled the appointment of the royal governors in the American colonies, replaced the previous guy, Belcher, who was like slow moving the Maine expansion, with this guy named Shirley. He did not like the approach that Belcher was using. He shared the speculator's desire for more wealth and power. He hadn't gotten his cut yet in terms of land speculation. And he really lacked sort of any of the sort of practical, you could make an argument like, he's kind of begging for war. It's gonna cost a lot of money. Maybe that's gonna, not worth it at the time. But nonetheless, he's like, people like Sam Waldo, he's like them, and he wants to kind of support this more expansive and denial of sort of Indian deeds and sort of this rule of law that, remember, the Europeans had created this rule, these set of rules, right? They had said the hierarchy is the crown has to be the one that gets the deed and the agreement from the Indians. Not any Joe, not just anyone out there who meets an Indian can get some land or title. It has to be the representative of the sovereign. So this tension gets played out here on the frontier with fairly disastrous consequences. So Saxene, this is basically his conclusion in his piece where he says, oh, this is an interesting case. Penobscot's won a court case. That's probably the last court case we won. No, I'm joking. So although they did not subscribe to English property law, Wabanakis occasionally succeed in turning it to their advantage, right? After Dummer's Treaty, they cooperated with Massachusetts leaders who were themselves speculators in order to preserve their sovereignties, right? So the speculators, as long as those ones are in control and not really focused on the District of Maine. That this was a marriage of convenience was a point made all too clear in the 1740s when the rise of new land companies claiming ownership from titles not descended from Indian land sales. So this need for more treaties that recognize deeds that no Indians had ever sanctioned, basically. This is what, and the only thing that really disrupts it, and only for a really short time, is the American Revolutionary War. The tensions are growing and growing basically from 1750 into the 1770s. So by the early 1750s, Shirley, the newer guy, right, and his captain, I don't know how to, is it Jabes? No, Jabez, Jabes. Anyway, this guy Bradbury, they made dramatic moves to clear the Kennebec. So, right, Norwich Walk is 1724. In a few years, a lot of Kennebec Indians moved back into the area. Not as many as had been previous, because now there's a fort just down the road here, right? And then but starting in the 1750s, they really start to clear out, right? Really, again, a kind of terror campaign against Indians here in the Kennebec. In this context, the only sort of the bigger group of Indians that were sort of fighting back the English at the time were not the small number of sort of Wabanaki, Kennebec Indians locally, but the larger community that was up in Canada called, referred to as the St. Francis Indians, the Wabanaki from Odanak. And so they're actually launching counter raids, because many of the people who are now residing at Odanak are actually originally from the Kennebec River Valley. So there's this connection. People feel very precious about it. And when they can do strategic attacks to counter the English, they're doing that. Okay, so that's messing up Shirley's plans to really create a whole, I mean, of course, we're all here now, right? So it's going, but I mean, the whole Kennebec being like this English space. So this starts to heat up enough where in 1754 and 55, Shirley demands Penobscot warriors to fight against these incursions, saying, hey, you all agreed to be subjects of the English crown. One of the things that the English crown can do is like force your guys into fighting a war for us. And you know who we want you to fight against? Your cousins over there. And so the Penobscot diplomats are like, I don't think so, but we'll get back to you. So there's a sort of pause in negotiations, but it keeps coming back. It keeps coming back. And while considering this, at one of the treaty councils, scalp hunters from Massachusetts attacked basically the primary Penobscot settlement at Owl's Head. They kill 14 men, they take several captives, so it's like a whole thing. So the Penobscots really don't trust the English at this point. So there's really no possibility for a negotiation after that incursion. So they're like, absolutely. And actually, there's almost no treaty possibility after this for a while. So upon refusal, the Penobscots to provide these warriors, Shirley's like, they set up a meeting, no Penobscots show up. They try to set up another meeting, no one shows up. And so they're like, I guess they're just on the run now from us. And that's when Spencer Phipps issues the proclamation for Penobscot scalps, right? 1755. So, mistranslation, misunderstanding. Now we're giving money for people to hunt Penobscots for scalps, right? That discourse of events, right, is how the structures of all of this kind of come to bear on what we would otherwise think of as sort of, the tragedies of Maine expansion frontier, the racist undertones of this, all of the things that kind of frame up this engagement. I'm sure many of you have seen this, 50 pounds for a captive, but then 40 pounds for male Penobscot scalps, for 25 pounds for female captives, 20 pounds for female scalps, et cetera, et cetera. And I just want to end that sort of discourse because a lot of the, obviously Penobscots were still here. And I just wanted to reference my friend James's piece of art where he rethinks this proclamation from a contemporary perspective as an artist. So in a piece, he calls, and actually the Penobscot word means we walk on, or we walk on eternally. Our presence in the landscape is not, it's not erasable, is basically, even with this act of violence against us, right? So as an artist and as an amazing storyteller and scholar, right, James has captured this rethinking and repositioning of the Phipps Proclamation. So what are my reflections and conclusions? Mistranslations, sometimes poison pills, words like municipality maybe, can create peace for a while. Racist and ethnocentric systems of interpretation shape the eventual resolution of mistranslation. We've seen this again and again. And then, so what can we learn? Maybe we can learn, maybe we can't learn. I'm not one of those, I'm not truly trained as a historian, I'm an anthropologist. So, you know, I know people say, we learn history so as to not repeat it. It feels like we are repeating a lot of history right now. So, and I feel like people know it. I mean, I don't know, towards the beginning of this pandemic, I looked at the reaction and attempt to react to the Spanish flu. And I don't know how deep any of you went at it, but right down to people protesting masks. Every single thing, same. Eventually people, unfortunately, we're now in the, I guess we're all just sick of it phase. And we're seeing, so, I mean, whatever you want to make of it. Even when we understand it, I'm not sure what that means, but anyway, I do think there's a real shift. And I think it's partly because of, like last week's speaker, you know, a reframe of how we understand these pasts and how we engage them. There's some real hope for possibility, healing, all the things that I know that in this community too has sort of put us all asunder. So that's where I'm going to end. Thank you. All right. Any questions? When do we end? It's like 9 o'clock, right? 10 o'clock, something like that. I saw you up back actually first. Yeah.
I was wondering, what do you think about the recent events? And I just don't really understand what happened really. 2 weeks ago or something, or less than that, Governor Mills said no to sort of tribal sovereignty. And then just this week, okay to sports bet.
Sure.
I just was curious, like, I don't know if you want to talk about what is going on.
What is going on with all that? It's crazy. Sure. So what is going on is a reference to Governor Mills saying she would veto the sovereignty omnibus bill, referred to as LD 1626. But her counter bill to that, which is called LD 585, which included Wabanaki tribal control over online sports betting in places not in casinos. So that was an amendment to that. So the casinos also have online. Anyway, what do I think about that? Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear. Like, you know, the myself and tribal leadership, we actually view more important would be the sovereignty omnibus bill. We would prefer to have the same kind of sovereignty all the other tribes have. We're federally recognized. We, again, the 1975 Passamaquoddy v. Morton case very much clarified not only that we had very real land claims to about 2/3 of the state of Maine because of illegal treaties, but also that we were fully tribes, fully federally recognized tribal nations. You know, I see it as a political thing. Obviously, we're talking about politicians. Yeah, if you want to screw things up, just get some politicians involved. You know, I think it's as Wabanaki people, we're true believers in our sovereignty and that we will eventually have it. We will better ourselves. Once we do, we will better our neighbors when we do as well. The governor has her own political decision-making framework. I think it's influenced by, I think it's a misunderstanding that some of the people in the business community are worried that tribes will have a certain regulatory authority that will impact their businesses. And I think that's why the governor has been consistently steadfast against tribal sovereignty, probably even more so when she was the attorney general. You know, we were able to sort of lay out, I think, a really compelling case that we should be treated equally like other Indians from across the country. Got a lot of friends to see it our way. Didn't get enough, you know. So I think, you know, that's our political moment. You know, the chiefs issued a letter last week saying, or the week before, saying, you know, our preference would always be for our sovereignty. You know, oddly enough, the system that we're seeking to be treated equally in is actually it's not great. It's just better than what we have. You know, I think us deciding our own futures as tribes makes a lot of sense. So, you know, I'm a scholar. I'm convinced when I look around, you know, when tribes are fully sovereign and acting in their own interests in ways that are productive for their communities, their neighboring communities benefit. That's just research. That's just like facts, right? So you want to help rural Maine, you know, support tribal sovereignty. That would be my suggestion. Washington County, Aroostook County, support tribal sovereignty. That's because if you look at, you know, Washington County, right, is one of the poorest counties in the whole country, you know, where tribes get more authority and control over their own livelihoods, their own futures, those counties become more self-sustaining. So I don't know. To me, that's the fundamental thing. I think it's about equality. I think it's about that stuff too.
I look at it that gambling is a corruption. And she says, that's okay, go right ahead.
Yeah.
And do that.
Yeah. So I'm just going to play out her logic, you know, as a moderate Democrat. And I think it makes a lot of sense. Like if I were to say, I mean, one of the things that would be a part of our sovereignty is our ability to have certain kinds of gaming, certain kinds of economic enterprise. So she found one that doesn't take away or challenge a contemporary business in the state of Maine. So I think that's what's driving her logic. And it's also a way for her to soothe the more left-leaning part of her party that became true believers of our sovereignty. So remember a couple, like before she said, I'm not gonna sign your sovereignty bill, she said, I will veto my own bill if you put this other one on my desk. Did you know that? So, I mean, she backed away from that, but I think it's just political. Okay, so I think, so she's a politician, she has political logic she's trying to deal with. Is gaming, yeah, gaming's generally a distraction because it splits people, right? If we had our full sovereignty, gaming might be something we would develop as an economic resource, but this idea of a carve out, right, is a little bit of a distraction.
Were the tribe's future any more favorable under the page? Direct opposite to Melbourne. So
No.
really, does gaming have anything to do with it? Does political persuasion of who's in the governor's seat have anything to do with it? It's been resisted for years.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, and I agree that we've made huge gains, you know, in this recent past, and it's been on the ability of a bunch of friends and Wabanaki leaders to fashion a whole new possibility. And I think that's, if I were to tell the story, I would tell it that way, right? The Wabanaki diplomacy is, it's not, it's the same, if anything, it's still the same legislate, I mean, I guess I'm just cynical and I don't, yeah, are Mills and LePage different? Of course. Are they that different in terms of tribal issues? A little bit, not, but I mean, if you were to think like, what are the possibilities? There's a lot, of other possibility. LePage signed the Truth and Reconciliation legislation to examine child welfare issues with the tribes in the state. The first state in the whole country to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, he could say like, I'm a good tribal partner for that. So I guess most of us who are Indians, like, we haven't had a lot of luck with Democrats or Republicans. It hasn't been, I mean, Joe Brennan and a lot of Democrats from the 70s and 80s, they made their political careers saying no to Indians. Like, they're like, absolutely no nation within a nation. Geez, we called them Indian Fighting Joe on Indian Island. Like the idea that they're sort of a political party that sort of is ascendant. I agree. Most of the friends we have are liberal Democrats right now because they're the ones that asked us, what do we want? And they listened. And I think that's the difference. But there are other people that have asked and listened too.
So are you a citizen of the United States?
Sure.
Are you a citizen of the state of Maine? Do you pay taxes?
Yeah, although 585, if I move to my reservation and work for the tribe, I won't pay state
So
taxes.
you pay Maine taxes and
Sure.
there we go.
What does that mean?
Well, that just means that you're like everybody else.
I'm a dual citizen. I'm a citizen of the Penobscot Nation.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying. Why is there, at this day and age, is there such a fight? I just don't get it, why it continues.
Why is it?
Why are they trying to keep you from having rights? Because you're a citizen.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's, yeah, my rights as a Penobscot Nation citizen, right, in the way that the state has done its work is, yeah, it's not equal with the other tribes. I tried to reckon why the governor in particular, or why people in Maine. I think there's, if I were to say like, there's a couple of things that people are afraid of. And politics is all based on fear, right? Can we agree with that? So people are just afraid of change, first of all, and then they're afraid, I think, at its core, perhaps people are afraid, like, will the Indians, if they have more control, will they do to us what we did to them? I often think that. And I don't think it's, I mean, I think the Attorney General and the governor said like, federal Indian law is not settled law, and so there might be more lawsuits. I wholeheartedly disagree that I think the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act is clearly not settled law. And, compare the number of lawsuits out of just that one law and just our few tribes and compare that to the rest of hundreds and hundreds of tribes. And we compare it, statistically, demographically, federal Indian law is far more settled than the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act. So the idea that they have questions or there might be unsettled law thing, it is like, I do think it's this, what does it threaten? There's this potential for tribes having certain regulatory infrastructure that might impact non-native people. But why are you so afraid? Why so afraid of that? I mean, ultimately it's like, well, we just don't trust it because we don't trust them because they're Indians or because it's new. Or because it's new. Because it's just like, it's not what we have. I think that's it. I might be missing something. Yeah.
This is fascinating.
Yeah.
Especially the misunderstanding aspect of this. And I'm wondering about the concept and whether in your opinion, experience, that with the Claims Act, there was misunderstanding.
For sure.
Whether there might have been misunderstanding.
Sure.
And especially with respect to the actual claims aspect, which to my read about,
Yeah.
we're talking about 2/3 of the state in terms of
Sure.
land as the claim.
Yeah.
So the fear factor is probably pretty high.
Yeah.
And if we're looking at a politician who's both a lawyer as an attorney general and a governor of we the people in the state,
Sure.
with respect to the Claims Act and the challenge of federal sovereignty to the Claims Act, is there misunderstanding in the Claims Act, about to Native peoples?
Yeah.
Was there misunderstanding?
Yeah.
And with respect to Governor Moses' approach to this, is one of the approaches that, well, the Claims Act is a complicated thing. And we need to kind of just unweave it rather than just let it go.
Mhm.
We really ought to unweave it. And we ought to unweave it with Native people.
Mhm.
And we ought to unweave it with the legislature. If that read is even remotely clear,
Yeah.
is it a legitimate one?
Yeah.
Especially if there might be misunderstanding with respect to the original settlement.
Yeah. No, so I'll repeat the question. It's such an easy question. I think the question is really about misunderstanding, say, with the Settlement Act, and then what do you do in situations where there is misunderstanding? I don't think, I think that's a really good story, that you shared, which is like, in situations where there is misunderstanding, let's deliberately work on it and unweave it slowly but surely. In fact, that's where 1626 came from, was a very deliberative process that people worked on over years and came up with the fixes to the misunderstandings. It's already a negotiated thing, and I think that's like, one of the jokes out there in sort of Indian, like in the communities, is like, sometimes in the context of the state, it's like, so we have this negotiated thing, and then now we're negotiating really with ourselves in our previous compromise, and now it's like, let's slow it down even more. I think shifts in legislation there will always be that, right? There will always be, right? People didn't vote for civil rights legislation a lot of times because they're like, it's too fast. We're unsure, public accommodations clause in the Civil Rights Act. How are we going to enforce that? What is it going to mean it's not constitutional. It's like all the things. And they're like, no, this is just. It's just fair. It's just, you set up a system that was built upon racism, falseness, and the fix is, you don't write it on a napkin over dinner. You talk about it for years. You come up with the solutions, make it equitable, and then suddenly we're at, let's do it slower, right? Let's just, slow it down. Not so sure, right? We've heard that. We've heard that before. It's a very familiar story of resistance to change. I don't know. Where do you want to be on that part of history? That's my response, I guess, to your narrative, because it's already, that way. Yeah, question.
How do you avoid despair?
How do I avoid despair? That's a good question. I have felt despair over the last month or two, that's for sure. I think you can step back. I do think, quite honestly, there's progress been made. I am floored by friends that have been made who support tribal sovereignty. I am floored by that. It didn't seem possible a decade ago, not on this scale. Like, it didn't seem possible. Definitely didn't seem possible when I was a kid, and that there was fear, right, around the Settlement Act. I remember that. I was only 8 or 9 years old, but I remember that. So I think, yeah, I mean, you take a moment in time, you take a breath. Laurent, I take real insight from Laurent and his diplomatic skills and his ability to speak truth. Our leaders have been really great through this. You all have, you've heard them speak. They don't, again, the fineness of our mind and our diplomacy mitigates, it's sort of like, if we're really angry, then we're not very sympathetic also, right? If we are of despair, if we are, start calling everyone racist and they're, like, it doesn't go anywhere. We know that, but it is the diligence of this diplomacy that keeps us coming and articulating our truth, right? And the chiefs said that in their letter. They're like, it's clear what we want. You guys asked us. We said, this is just. You worked with us on it. It's kind of out of our hands now in terms of the sovereignty omnibus bill. Governor says she'll veto it. It didn't get funded. Maybe it'll get funded in these last few sessions. And then it will go to her desk and she'll veto it or not, or whatever. But that's the mark in our stand. That's the standard that we've come up with. We've articulated. It got enough votes to pass our legislature. Maybe the next legislature won't pass it. I mean, you feel like the country is going to go in this other direction, and some of our friends are going to get voted out, and we won't have the votes anymore. That's totally possible. Yeah.
Question on Zoom from Colin, basically asking, saying Maine has a complex and interesting history, but very little of it gets worked into the K-12 curriculum. Do you have suggestions on how to improve that or existing resources schools can?
Yeah. Oh, yes. K through 12 curriculum. So I've been part of, Donna Loring helped shepherd a piece of legislation back in 2001, sometimes referred to as LD 291, Maine Indian History and Culture Law, which actually requires Maine Indian history and culture to be taught in all schools, K through 12. Its implementation has been quite partial, but we are in a new era for that. There's a lot of energy around implementing that law. I see a lot of work. A lot of us who are Native educators in the state have worked both with the State Department of Education, but even I think the biggest shifts have been with the Portland School District, which has developed in cooperation and consultation with tribal educators, a K through 12 curriculum. It's slowly coming online. And there's a lot of hopes that that will lead to a curriculum that can be further disseminated, further implemented across the state. We haven't had this level of curricular development. We're also working at the University of Maine, requiring that teachers, any teacher with a certificate, we don't have this yet, but I'm very hopeful we're going to get it soon. Requiring all teachers who are certified in the state of Maine have training in LD 291. So all these things we're at moments of shift there. But yeah, it's been very piecemeal and partially implemented. There are people, locally, I know, folks like Barry Dana, former Penobscot chief, he goes to a lot of schools here locally. But we need a curriculum that doesn't require Barry or myself, so it doesn't, we need it all the way, every school, all the time. And that's why you need a real sort of thoughtful curriculum that utilizes the best of what we know about including us as Wabanaki people. I saw you back there.
So I'm going to take a little bit of a different
interruption, but we've been talking a lot about education, and you happen to mention the Bowdoin land grants. And
Yeah.
to what extent are there private colleges in Maine helping to participate in education and in opportunities for Wabanaki?
So the question is, what role are the private colleges having in Wabanaki education and different things? It's been real partial. There have been fits and starts around it. I think, I mean, I'm gonna just say, like, well, we have definitely the most engagement and research and lots of excitement. I mean, I think University of Maine we're the center of that work. John Bear and I and a whole host of other people, there's no other place like it in the state where we have native faculty, we have a student support center, we have an infrastructure for support, and that we have a lot of research that's going on in collaboration with the tribes, and that's bringing in a lot of resources to the state. So the colleges are they have small footprints, right? So it's hard. They've all, the three major private colleges, right? They've all had programs for engagement with the tribes. They've just been sort of through fits and starts. And I think it's hard to have an infrastructure because they have they have kind of small footprints. I think they'll hire a single native person often. It's usually not a great idea if you're the only one doing something at a place that might be slightly hostile, not hostile in a purposeful way, but like you're just the only one doing that thing. That can be really tricky, especially early career people, So I think they've tried a lot of different things. I have hope. Whenever they call me, I'm always like, hey, if you want any advice, I'm there to give it, because I believe that everyone can and should be involved in the work. So I was worked with Colby is trying to develop critical Indigenous studies. I helped them last year with some of their programming. Bates is, Joe Hall, who's a historian over there, he's done a lot of engagement in his history classes with some of the tribes. And Colby did a great exhibit a couple of years ago. Bowdoin has had similar kinds of events around decolonization and kind of incorporated some of the tribes. So there's pieces of it. It's just hasn't quite gelled yet in any of the places, but I'm hoping. Yeah.
I've seen over the years that Indigenous voices seem to be gaining some traction with by speaking out against some of the issues, environmental issues, climate change, pressure that's putting on Indigenous land. And I wonder how you see that as an effective way, perhaps to achieve sovereignty.
Yeah.
To sort of push the point that you do need to have some control.
Yeah, so the question is about Indigenous people's voices being very central to issues like the environment and that kind of issue. I totally agree with you. I think the last decade, if you look at sort of how we even discuss things like climate justice and environmental justice, Indigenous people, especially in climate justice, have a very central role. I do think that as Indigenous people, our articulation of our care for place, which you heard about last week as well, like that intimacies that we have as Wabanaki people to places, could be part of why people are reluctant to support our sovereignty. I think there's a sense that we care for it too much and that it would be interfering with business operations. But I agree with you. I think, and it's its own awakening, even with Indigenous people. Like there is this sense of we all live under the same threats, climate, disaster, all the things that we see every day, things that are increasing in intensity and that sort of thing. I think there has also been, while a constancy to Indigenous sort of systems of engagement and care for non-humans, all that, I think there's forms of awakenings and reawakenings and prophecies coming to bear through Indigenous peoples and relations as well. So I think we are all caught up in moments, right? In this moment. So I see that as, it's not, it's not surprising per se, but it is that the articulation of it, the recognition of it, it has been a real shift, I think, as well. That just shows you, because I was so like, that's my area of most of my research. So that's like, I was really ahead of my time. It's basically what I'm saying. No, sorry. Yeah.
Another online question asking you to speculate on a possible extension of Native American rights 100 years from now.
All right. 100 years from now, Native American. I mean, you look at it 100 years ago, it's the shape of it, the push-pull around it. It wasn't great 100 years ago. It wasn't, the Dawes Act, happened in 1887. A form of the Dawes Act happened a few, years before here in Maine, meaning the Dawes Act basically where tribes had signed treaties for their lands. And even so here in Maine, for example, this is totally tangent, but I think it'll help me answer the question. Here in Maine in the 19th century, with the founding of the state of Maine, 1820 going forward, even though there were these illegal treaties post 1790, there was a sort of not really clear treaty in 1818 and 1820 with Penobscot Nation. Then in the 1830s, the state basically just seized the 4 townships up in the Millinocket area that we had fought so hard for preserving through every single treaty. It was like the core of our sort of hunting homeland was this Millinocket 4 townships. And the state just took, it's just a joke. I mean, the notions of fraud and just ignoring your own rules to just take land from people is just, and there was a report just released by Donna Loring, Eric Maynard, and a couple other people, sort of One Nation Under Fraud. I don't know, you guys should, it details a lot of these fraudulent state dealings with the tribes here. So, I'm not gonna say like, oh, 100 years ago was better. Was it necessarily worse? Probably, because of a whole host of other factors. I think we're ascendant. I think for there to be a future of humanity, I think Indigenous people are going to have a central role in that, on our planet. If we don't, maybe even with our days may be numbered here on the planet as human beings, or at least in our current condition. I'm just being realist. We just don't really want to act around certain things I think are really critical. But I do think, I'd say ascendant. I think tribal leadership, our engagement with place, the story, we've done this really amazing work recently with the land trust and conservation community. That has put some real life in their work too. Be able to tell the story of places across the state of Maine. I think there's a lot of really great possibilities. So I'm gonna say I'm optimistic. So no despair.
But can you give us more detail about what is happening with the land trust?
Oh my God, how many hours do you have? So there just been some partnerships starting in 2017, some relationships built, some education, and there are now lots of cooperation, even sort of in terms of land access, land return, cooperative work that will protect areas, will create more access points for Indigenous cultural stewardship and harvesting. Often with our principles, our stewardship and harvesting are one and the same, right? That, when we pick sweetgrass the way we pick it, it returns more the next year, right? So our traditions of harvesting and stewardship and the intimacies of those places are about renewal and stewarding. And my friend and elder Carol Data doesn't like the word steward. Our engagement and relationship with these places are are being highlighted in this work. So yeah, thousands of acres have already been sort of, if you go to Sunlight Media, you can see the return of Pine Island. That happened in partnership with land trusts. Quimby and Elliottsville returned some land to Penobscot Nation. There's things going on out there that are really powerful. There's Indigenous youth and leadership with locally here, the Bombazine Land Trust. There's a whole host of other sort of movements like that. So that are, and they're in conversation with all these great young farmers in Maine around the creation of the permacultures and the food sovereignty. This is the ethos that drives this is shared across native and non-native. So I think there's some real amazing work.
Yeah, what is the relationship with the tribes and the logging and paper industry?
Yeah, the relationship between the tribes and the logging and paper industry. Well, it hasn't been great. It's not as much of a paper industry in Maine anymore. There are just a few places that has that. I wrote my dissertation on Lincoln pulp and paper and dioxin pollution. So I know a little bit about this, but I'll just say, yeah, it hasn't been great, but even through that process, which was about, and I can tell you the story of where that eventually went, but Lincoln pulp and paper is no longer there. Probably you guys know that. That's not because of the tribes. That's, there's a lot of extractive industries that have moved out of Maine for a variety of reasons, mostly just the economics of it. I think there are, I won't say the paper industry per se, but I think there are industries that have had histories, not all of them. There's some of them are key holdouts, and I think that's part of what the governor is responding to and not supporting the tribal sovereignty stuff. There are some key ones around forest products that may or may not, that are not fully on board with tribes yet. But I think there are some real opportunities for relationships. I think we've done some of our research at the University of Maine looking at how forest certification allows for Indigenous harvesting and participation. There were new federal rules around federal lands and parklands that there's access and harvesting agreements. But I think, yeah, I think that's one of the hardest nuts to crack. I think, industries that feel like they're, going bye-bye in the state of Maine. One extra thing can shut them down. I think that's a very real fear for them. I think they see it, I think they see it in a limited way though. I think you have a tribe nearby, that's a partner, not a threat. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think, all through the process of Lincoln pulp and paper, I know because I wrote my dissertation, Penobscot Nation did not want Lincoln pulp and paper to be shut down. We just didn't want dioxin to be, discharged into the place where we fish. I mean, that seems kind of like, okay, let's find a way to get there. But it was like, they were being propped up. They were a small company, but they were supported by lawyers and an industry at the time. They were like, if you give an inch, they'll take a mile. Like, then we're all under threat. So they were incentivized not to cooperate. And I think, is that the way of the world? I don't know. I guess we can accept that or not accept that. But I would just say, I'm hoping that there is a more possibility for those relations, even with the people who are afraid of tribal regulatory infrastructure. I think, again, when I look at the research, when tribes are doing good, the communities near them are doing good. Let's just start there. So, yeah. How many more hours do I have here, Susan? All right, thanks. Thank you.